Have you ever wondered what really happens when the cameras turn off and the greatest icons in global sports meet away from the spotlight? What could Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time, and Cristiano Ronaldo, the global soccer star, possibly have in common beyond millions in contracts and fame that transcends borders? For years, a secret was kept under lock and key, a pact between giants that forever changed the fate of a small hospital in one of the most remote corners of Mozambique. What really happened that night on a Parisian rooftop when two of the most competitive athletes in history decided to join forces? Why did they keep everything in absolute secrecy for so long? And how did a single 8-year-old child struggling to survive with a faulty heart trigger an international operation that defied the impossible? Get ready to discover the story that not even the most intrusive tabloids could uncover. The side of Cristiano Ronaldo the world has never seen, finally revealed by the only person he trusted with his deepest secret. The spotlights blinked 3 times, signaling the return of the show after the commercial break. The audience erupted into deafening applause as Stephen Colbert pointed toward the side entrance of the studio. The lights shifted to a deep blue hue as the host enthusiastically announced a name that needed no further introduction. Michael Jordan emerged from behind the curtains, wearing a flawlessly tailored gray suit, every detail highlighting the elegance the former basketball player always displayed both on and off the court. His signature smile lit up his face as he waved to the fully standing crowd. Some people in the front rows held out old Chicago Bulls jerseys, hoping for an autograph that might never come. Jordan walked with the same confidence he exuded when entering the court during the decisive moments of his career. The ovation lasted nearly 2 full minutes, something rare even for top-tier guests on that show. "Now that's what I call a warm welcome," Jordan commented, finally sitting in the armchair next to Colbert's desk. "Can you still throw down one of those dunks?" someone in the audience shouted, prompting widespread laughter. The murmuring in the audience gradually faded as Colbert adjusted his iconic black frame glasses, leaning slightly forward in his chair. The chemistry between interviewer and guest was palpable even before the first official question. The lighting crew softened the lights, creating a more intimate atmosphere in the studio, which held more than 300 people fully immersed in anticipation of what was to come. Jordan relaxed his shoulders, an almost imperceptible gesture that signaled his comfort in that environment. Colbert opened the conversation by mentioning the former player's new business ventures, his recent achievements in the corporate world, and the cherished memories fans held of his professional basketball glory days. The mood was light, filled with occasional jokes and references to iconic moments in Jordan's sports career. "People always ask if I miss the days of competition," said Jordan, gently running his hand through his perfectly trimmed hair. "And do you?" Colbert replied, raising an eyebrow with genuine curiosity. The cameras captured every detail of the conversation, which flowed naturally, as if it were a chat between old friends, rather than a televised interview watched by millions. Jordan spoke about his recent investments, about how he transformed his passion for sports into a business empire that transcended borders and cultures. Colbert occasionally glanced at his note cards but rarely needed them, keeping near constant eye contact with his guest. The audience reacted in perfect sync, laughing at the jokes and respectfully absorbing the more reflective moments of the talk. The discreetly placed digital clock near the set showed they were halfway through the planned segment. That's when Colbert decided to slightly shift the direction of the interview, looking for an angle the media hadn't yet explored. "Your investments in soccer have been growing lately," Colbert noted, flipping through a few pages of his notes. "Soccer is the most universal sport there is. It connects cultures that might never otherwise meet," Jordan replied with a conviction that surprised even the host. The tone of the conversation shifted almost imperceptibly as Colbert, after a brief, strategic pause, posed the question that would become a turning point of the evening. "Who is the most impressive soccer player you've ever met?" The answer came almost instantly, without hesitation, as if it had been on the tip of his tongue, just waiting for the right opportunity to be spoken. "Cristiano Ronaldo," said Jordan. And the moment the name left his lips, something changed in his expression. It wasn't theatrical or exaggerated, but a subtle transformation that did not go unnoticed by Colbert or the cameras that captured every microfacial movement. Jordan's eyes, always alert and confident, took on a different depth, as if he had momentarily been transported to another place, another memory. "Did you meet him at some event?" Colbert asked, realizing he had touched on something significant. "Yes, we've met a few times, but there was one specific moment that, well, let's just say it changed a lot," Jordan replied, choosing his words carefully. The studio audience sensed the shift in atmosphere. The laughter gave way to an expectant silence, as if everyone collectively realized they were about to witness something beyond a typical celebrity interview. Colbert, with the skill of a seasoned interviewer, recognized the opportunity to explore seemingly uncharted ground. He softened his voice, leaning even further forward, creating an environment conducive to confidences. "Sounds like there's an interesting story there," he remarked, leaving the space open for Jordan to decide how much he wanted to share. The camera zoomed in on the face of the former basketball player, capturing the exact moment he seemed to decide internally whether or not to proceed with what was on his mind. The tension was almost palpable, growing with each second of contemplative silence. "I met Ronaldo in France during the launch of his brand a few years ago," Jordan began, his voice taking on a different texture, deeper and more reflective. "But what happened afterward completely changed my view of him," he added after a brief pause that seemed to last an eternity. Jordan's fingers lightly tapped on the edge of the armchair, a rare sign of restlessness in someone known for his unshakable self-control. He began describing the event in Paris, painting with words the glamorous setting typical of major sports brand launches. He spoke about the lights, the celebrities in attendance, the international press eager to capture every moment, every interaction. His narrative was vivid, transporting the audience to that luxurious hall in the French capital, making them almost smell the expensive champagne and hear the murmur of sophisticated conversations. Jordan described how Ronaldo moved through the environment with the same grace he displayed on the soccer fields, greeting guests, posing for photos, being the impeccable host his position required. Everything seemed aligned with the public image of the Portuguese star until Jordan abruptly stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if he had reached an invisible limit, a boundary he wasn't sure he should cross. "There's something very specific about his behavior that night," said Jordan, his gaze momentarily lost in memories. "Something that deeply changed my perception of who Cristiano Ronaldo really is," he continued, refocusing on Colbert. A respectful silence took over the studio. No one coughed, no one whispered, not even the usual noise from the recording equipment seemed audible at that moment. Colbert, normally quick with witty remarks, remained completely silent, honoring the weight of that moment. Jordan's expression had completely transformed. The confident smile gave way to a serious, almost solemn demeanor. His eyes reflected an intensity rarely seen outside the basketball courts during his competitive years. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a tone of revelation, like someone about to share a long-held secret. "There's something about Ronaldo that no one knows, Stephen," he said, looking directly at the host. "Something we've kept secret for a long time." The camera captured Colbert's reaction, his eyebrows slightly raised in genuine surprise. Not the theatrical surprise often seen on talk shows, but the true expression of someone intrigued by the unexpected turn of the conversation. "This sounds serious," Colbert remarked almost in a whisper, as if afraid to break the moment with his voice. "It's much deeper than anyone could imagine," Jordan confirmed with an almost imperceptible nod. The audience remained completely still, as if collectively holding their breath. The 300 spectators in the studio seemed to have turned into statues, completely absorbed by the tension emanating from that conversation. The studio lights seemed to dim even more, creating an almost confessional atmosphere. Jordan adjusted his posture in the chair, took a deep breath, and looked directly into the main camera, the one broadcasting his image into millions of homes around the world. This was no longer just an interview. It had transformed into a moment of truth, a revelation that seemed to transcend the casual format of the show. The seconds that followed seemed to stretch endlessly as everyone waited for the conclusion of that partially told story. "But I think I can finally share this story now," said Jordan, his voice firm in contrast to the visible emotion in his eyes. Cristiano gave me permission last week when we spoke about the impact of what we built together, he revealed, a nearly imperceptible tear forming in the corner of his right eye. The studio remained in absolute silence, the tension growing exponentially with each word uttered by the legendary basketball player. The impending revelation hung in the air like a solemn promise, something that went beyond entertainment and entered the realm of fundamental truths about character and humanity. The cameras captured every nuance of Jordan's expression, every subtle movement that revealed the emotional depth of the moment. His left hand rested firmly on the armrest of the chair, as if seeking physical stability to match the emotional courage required for what he was about to reveal. Colbert remained motionless, his face a mix of respect and genuine curiosity. This was not just another TV moment. It was a portal to an unknown truth about one of the greatest sports stars in the world, about to be revealed by another sports legend. The climax was approaching, and everyone in the studio felt the historical weight of that instant. What I saw that night in Paris completely changed not just my view of Cristiano Ronaldo, but the true meaning of using our influence in the world, Jordan continued, his gaze now distant, as if transported back to that night. The studio remained in absolute silence as Jordan began to recount the events of that fateful night in the City of Light. The studio lights dimmed slightly, creating an almost cinematic atmosphere, as if the lighting itself wanted to contribute to the immersion in the story that was about to be revealed. It was one of those parties that seems straight out of a movie, you know? The kind of event where every inch breathes luxury and exclusivity. Jordan gestured with his hands as he spoke, his whole body engaged in the narrative. The Hotel de Crillon, one of the oldest and most luxurious in Paris, had been completely transformed for Cristiano's new collection launch. Crystal chandeliers that looked like suspended constellations, red carpets stretching across golden halls, waiters with silver trays offering champagne in delicately crafted glasses. His voice transported not only Colbert, but every viewer into that setting of opulence. I remember thinking as I looked around, this man truly understands the meaning of grandeur. But I had no idea how wrong I was about the kind of greatness Cristiano truly valued. Everyone was there. Hollywood actors, international musicians, French dignitaries, sports legends, all gravitating around him like planets orbiting the sun, Jordan continued, his face lighting up with the vivid memory. Cristiano moved through the ballroom with that characteristic confidence, the perfect smile, the impeccably tailored suit, greeting each guest as if they were old friends. The camera flashes went off incessantly, capturing every movement, every handshake, every raised toast. Jordan paused, taking a sip of water from the crystal glass beside him. But I noticed something the cameras didn't catch. In those brief moments between photos, when he thought no one was looking, his smile would disappear. It was as if a mask momentarily fell away, revealing something completely different behind that perfectly constructed facade. I watched him for hours, intrigued by that duality, Jordan continued, leaning forward in his chair as if sharing a secret. I noticed that while he chatted animatedly with celebrities, his eyes would often drift toward one of the large French doors leading to one of the outdoor terraces. It was almost imperceptible to someone not specifically paying attention, but to someone who has lived decades under the spotlight, it was a clear sign. That man, at the height of his celebration, seemed desperate to escape. Jordan slowly shook his head, as if still processing the revelation. There's something deeply familiar in the look of someone who is performing rather than living the moment. I saw that same look in the mirror many times during my career. When the event began to wind down, around 2 in the morning, I followed my instinct and quietly walked toward that terrace that had caught his attention so many times that night, said Jordan, his voice now softer, more intimate. The contrast was surreal. From the hall full of laughter, music, and animated conversation to the near silence of that outdoor space. Paris stretched below like a carpet of flickering lights, the Eiffel Tower shining in the distance like a luminous sentinel. And there he was, alone, leaning over the old stone balustrade, gazing at the city with an expression I never imagined seeing on the face of the perpetually confident athlete the world knew. The emotion in Jordan's voice was palpable. There was such deep loneliness in that image. Cristiano Ronaldo, possibly the most famous man on the planet at that moment, completely isolated in the midst of his own success celebration. It was like seeing through the illusion that all of us public figures so carefully build. When he noticed my presence, he turned quickly, visibly startled, like someone caught in a moment of vulnerability he never intended to share. Jordan continued, now completely absorbed in his narrative. For a fraction of a second, I saw panic in his eyes, quickly replaced by relief when he recognized it was me. "Michael," he said, trying to regain his composure, "I thought everyone was still enjoying the party." There was a tension in his voice, a string stretched almost to its breaking point. I approached slowly, giving him space to collect himself or ask me to leave, if he wished. "Sometimes we just need to breathe a little, right?" I said, standing beside him, looking at the same Parisian landscape that had captured his attention. Especially when we're surrounded by people who only see what we project, not who we really are. A silence settled between us, not the uncomfortable kind that begs to be filled, but the meaningful kind that happens when two people recognize something fundamental in each other, recalled Jordan, his eyes shining with the intensity of the memory. Several minutes passed like that, just two men contemplating the nighttime city, each lost in his own thoughts, connected by a tacit understanding that transcended words. It was Cristiano who finally broke the silence, his voice so low I had to lean in to hear. "All this luxury," he began, gesturing vaguely toward the ballroom behind us. "Sometimes I feel like a fraud. While we celebrate expensive clothes, there are children in Mozambique who don't have the basics to live." The vulnerability in his voice caught me completely off guard. It wasn't the Cristiano Ronaldo the world knew speaking. It was just Cristiano, a man carrying a burden that few could understand. Jordan paused meaningfully. In that moment, I understood I was about to witness something rare, the truth behind the carefully constructed public image. "You know where I come from, don't you?" he asked, his eyes now fixed on mine, searching for some sign of genuine understanding. Jordan continued, his own voice heavy with the weight of that memory. I nodded. Everyone knew the story of his humble beginnings on the island of Madeira, but few truly understood what it meant. "Madeira isn't just beaches for tourists and luxury hotels," he went on, his Portuguese accent becoming more pronounced with emotion. "I grew up in a house where luxury was having enough food for dinner. My mother worked as a cook and cleaner, my father as a gardener, and still, there were days—" His voice faltered for a moment. "There were days when all we had was bread and soup." He looked away, as if ashamed of his own vulnerability. "People see what I have now, but they don't understand that I never forget what it's like to have nothing." While he spoke, Cristiano took his phone from the inner pocket of his impeccable suit, Jordan described, his gestures recreating the scene for the attentive audience. With fingers that almost trembled, he navigated to a photo folder and showed me images I will never forget. They weren't the glamorous photos his millions of followers might expect to see. They were raw images of improvised hospitals in remote regions of Mozambique, children with large alert eyes, some connected to rudimentary medical equipment, others simply lying on basic stretchers. "This is Antonio," he said, pointing to a boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with a smile that seemed to light up the photo despite the circumstances. "He was born with a heart condition that could be completely treatable with the right surgery. In Europe or the United States, it would be a routine operation. In Nampula, the region where he lives, there are no specialists, no equipment." His voice trembled with a restrained emotion that seemed ready to spill over at any moment. "I travel there whenever I can, without cameras, without publicity. I try to make a difference, Michael, but sometimes it feels like I'm using a spoon to empty the ocean." "I've donated millions through my foundation," he confessed, putting the phone away with reverent care, as if those images were personal treasures, Jordan continued, his own voice now laden with emotion. "But the bureaucratic barriers are enormous. Money and resources just take too long to reach those in urgent need." The frustration in his voice was palpable, a controlled anger not directed at people, but at systems that moved too slowly to save lives that were slipping away. "I built hospitals that took 3 years to be approved by local authorities. We sent equipment that got stuck in customs for months while children died waiting for it. We trained doctors who cannot practice because their certifications aren't recognized by official bodies." He ran his hand through his perfectly styled hair, a rare gesture of physical disarray that mirrored his inner turmoil. For every obstacle we overcome, three more appear. And while we fight through paperwork and stamps, real lives are being lost. I stayed silent for a long moment, absorbing everything Cristiano had shared, said Jordan, his serious expression reflecting the gravity of that conversation. All my life, I've used my platform to build a brand, to inspire athletes, to sell products. Here was a man using his influence to literally save lives and still feeling like it wasn't enough. How can I help? I finally asked. It wasn't an empty offer or a social courtesy. It was a genuine commitment born from the recognition of a cause greater than any sports achievement either of us had ever reached. Jordan paused, looking directly at Colbert. The way he looked at me at that moment, Stephen, there was an almost painful intensity in his eyes, a mix of hope and hesitation, as if he'd been waiting for years for someone to ask that exact question. Cristiano straightened, his eyes now locked onto mine with an almost feverish intensity. Jordan narrated, recreating that pivotal moment. It would require someone with your global influence, he began slowly, weighing each word. But what I'm thinking is extremely challenging. It would involve bypassing bureaucracies, accessing remote regions. He paused as if evaluating how much he could share, how much I would be willing to risk. I realized in that moment that he was about to invite me to something far beyond a simple donation or a charitable appearance. It was a call to a mission that would possibly challenge established norms, that would require real commitment. Before he could elaborate, his phone rang with a shrill urgency that cut through the Parisian night like an alarm. Cristiano's expression changed instantly to concern as he saw the caller ID. The tension was palpable in Jordan's voice as he recreated the moment. It was a video call from a hospital in Mozambique. Cristiano answered the call immediately, his entire body tense like a violin string about to snap. Jordan continued, his voice capturing the absolute attention of everyone in Colbert's studio. His trembling fingers held the phone as he activated the speaker, allowing me to hear as well. The image on the screen was grainy, a reflection of the unstable connection. But even so, I could clearly see the exhausted face of a man wearing a stained white lab coat. The walls behind him were a faded yellow, peeling in several places, and what seemed to be a noisy generator could be heard in the background. Jordan paused, his expression somber as he relived that moment. The contrast between that improvised hospital and the luxurious terrace in Paris where we stood was so stark, it felt like we'd been transported to another universe in a matter of seconds. The reality of that distant world invaded our bubble of privilege with the force of a hurricane. The doctor on the screen spoke rapidly in Portuguese, his trembling voice shifting between clinical desperation and brave attempts to maintain professional composure. Cristiano, forgive me for interrupting your event, but I don't know who else to turn to. We're losing him. Ronaldo's eyes transformed instantly, shifting from initial surprise to a focused intensity I had only seen before in athletes during the most crucial moments of competitions, Jordan described, gesturing to illustrate the change. He began asking specific questions quickly in Portuguese until he noticed my presence and switched to English. Dr. Paulo, this is Michael Jordan. He is someone I trust. Can you show us the patient and explain the situation? The doctor nodded, visibly surprised by my presence, but without time to fully process the strangeness of the situation. The camera shook as he moved through what seemed to be a narrow corridor, partially lit by intermittently flickering fluorescent lights. The sound of coughs and low moans could be heard in the background, along with the constant hum of an overloaded generator. Jordan adjusted his posture in the chair, his whole body communicating the seriousness of the moment he was describing. As we virtually walked through that makeshift hospital via the phone screen, Cristiano turned to me, his eyes pleading for understanding. This is the real deal, Michael. Not the million-dollar contracts, not the commercials, not the trophies. This is what really matters. The doctor finally stopped beside a small bed where a boy no older than 8 was lying. Jordan continued, his voice lowering out of respect for the gravity of the situation he described. His name was Sekou, as Dr. Paulo informed us. His skin had a grayish tone that, even through the limited video call quality, was visibly alarming. Improvised tubes connected his fragile body to equipment that looked like it belonged to another era. Old machines that buzzed and beeped irregularly. Beside the bed, a woman held his small hand, whispering words of comfort into his ear. The boy's eyes were half closed, but even so, when Dr. Paulo spoke his name, he tried to smile. That smile, Stephen, that simple smile of a child on the brink of death. Jordan interrupted his own narrative, visibly emotional. The show's audience remained in absolute silence, many viewers discreetly wiping tears. He has a severe heart condition, a severe aortic stenosis combined with a ventricular septal defect, explained the doctor, his technical terms painfully contrasting with the rustic simplicity of the environment. In any Western hospital, it would be a relatively routine surgery. Here, we don't even have the equipment or the necessary specialists. He has only a few days to live without specialized surgery, the doctor continued, his professionalism momentarily cracking, revealing the desperate man behind the lab coat. Our region is so remote that even international organizations would take weeks to get the necessary authorizations. We have already contacted all official channels, but bureaucracy. He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both Cristiano and I perfectly understood what was implied. By the time the paperwork was finally approved, signed and stamped, Sekou would no longer be there. The boy's mother looked directly at the camera, her eyes carrying a devastating mixture of hope and resignation. She did not speak English or Portuguese, but her expression transcended any language barrier. It was the universal look of a mother watching helplessly as her child's life slowly slipped away. Jordan paused, taking a sip of water, as if needing to gather strength to continue. Cristiano stepped back slightly from the phone screen, his voice low as he addressed me. Most people only see the goals, the cars, the mansions. This is what I see every night when I close my eyes. Kids like Sekou, who we can lose at any moment because the world we built values procedures more than people. After Dr. Paulo returned to his precarious workstation, Cristiano began explaining the situation to me in more precise detail. Jordan proceeded, his tone now loaded with the urgency of that moment. This makeshift hospital was located near Nampula, one of the most isolated regions of Mozambique, hundreds of kilometers from any significant urban center. What made the situation even more desperate was the rainy season, which had transformed many of the unpaved roads into impassable quagmires. There was no infrastructure for medical helicopters. The electrical grid was intermittent at best. The hospital itself ran on generators that often ran out of fuel. Clean water was a luxury. Basic medicines were rationed with meticulous care. The mere notion of a specialized heart surgery in that environment seemed not just unlikely, but almost impossible. Jordan's expression reflected the seriousness of the situation he described. As he spoke, I watched his transformation. The celebrated star from the Paris rooftop had completely disappeared, replaced by this man fully focused on solving a life-or-death problem. It's one of hundreds of cases, he explained, his whole body vibrating with restrained emotion. I have been trying for months to establish a permanent medical program, but every step forward is followed by 2 steps back. Infrastructure, corruption, political issues. It's layers upon layers of complications. That was the moment, Stephen, when something changed inside me, said Jordan, his intense gaze fixed on Colbert. My whole life I've been driven by challenges, by the insatiable hunger to win, to prove my ability. But those were always sports, business, personal challenges. There, confronted with that boy fighting for every breath in a hospital that barely deserved the name, I realized that maybe all my previous battles had been just games. This was real, visceral, definitive. It wasn't about points on a scoreboard or zeros in a bank account. It was about a human heart that would keep beating or not. The intensity in Jordan's voice was palpable, his usual composure giving way to raw emotion, rarely seen in the former athlete. Something crystallized inside me at that moment, an absolute clarity I rarely experienced outside the courts. I looked at Cristiano, who still stared at the now turned-off phone screen, as if he could see through it to the distant hospital where Sekou fought for his life. I have a friend with a private jet, I said, the words coming out almost before I could fully process them. And I know a heart surgeon in Zurich, one of the best in the world. Ronaldo's eyes widened slightly, A spark of hope emerging amidst the despair, Jordan continued, vividly recreating the moment for the audience. He studied me for a few seconds, as if trying to determine whether I was really suggesting what it seemed I was suggesting. "You understand what we're considering, right?" he finally asked, his voice almost a whisper. "There won't be time for official authorizations, for international protocols. We'd be operating completely outside the established channels." I nodded slowly, fully aware of the implications. In my years as a public figure, I had always been extremely cautious, meticulously protecting my image and reputation. What Cristiano was describing was risky not only logistically, but potentially legally and reputationally as well. Jordan laughed without humor, shaking his head slightly in recollection. But then a simple and devastating truth struck me. While we weighed risks on a Parisian terrace, Sekou was breathing his last hours thousands of kilometers away. What was the real risk here? A few negative tabloid headlines? A stain on the Michael Jordan brand? Compared to the life of a child, these concerns seemed not only trivial, but shamefully selfish. "I didn't suggest anything over the phone, Cristiano. I just asked if you'd like to go to Zurich with me tomorrow for an important meeting. We can discuss the rest in private." "That's how the most challenging and meaningful operation I've ever been involved in began," said Jordan, his eyes briefly scanning the audience before returning to Colbert. "In the next 2 hours, in the silence of that Parisian terrace, while the party continued without its guest of honor some floors below, Cristiano and I made more than 50 calls, each one discreet, carefully formulated, strategically targeted. I contacted Dr. Frederick Muller, a Swiss heart surgeon who had operated on my uncle years before, a man who not only possessed extraordinary skills, but also a sense of humanity that transcended borders. Cristiano activated his network of contacts in Mozambique, trusted people who could prepare the ground without alerting the layers of bureaucracy that would inevitably delay everything. We mobilized financial resources, medical equipment, essential supplies. Jordan's story now had the audience completely hypnotized, many leaning forward in their seats, absorbing every word. It was like being in a strategy room before a championship final, except the plays we were drawing up weren't to score points, but to transport an international medical team to one of the most remote places on Earth in a matter of hours, not days. Ronaldo commanded his phone like a maestro, switching fluently among 4 different languages, his face changing with each new call. "We need a smaller plane for the final leg," he murmured between calls, "something that can land on an unofficial runway, and we'll need someone who knows the terrain to guide us when we arrive." Colbert interrupted my narrative with an expression of disbelief that reflected the general feeling in the studio. Jordan smiled faintly, fully understanding the reaction. "Wait, you and Ronaldo organized an emergency medical mission on your own?" he asked, his famous glasses sliding slightly down his nose in surprise. "No official organizations? No governments involved?" Jordan nodded slowly, aware of the extraordinary nature of what he was revealing. "Yes, Stephen. That's exactly what we did. And believe me, that night, as we planned every detail, we were painfully aware of how many lines we were crossing. International aviation rules, cross-border medical protocols, jurisdiction and licensing issues. An endless list of carefully established regulations that we were prepared to completely ignore." Jordan's frankness was surprising, given his usual caution with public statements. But understand, it wasn't out of disrespect for rules or institutions. It was because the system, with all its complexity and layers of protection, simply wasn't built for cases like Sekou's. The very rules designed to protect lives ironically become nearly insurmountable obstacles when every minute counts. While bureaucracy follows its careful, methodical course, hearts stop beating. "The logistical challenges were monumental," Jordan explained, his voice reflecting the operation's complexity. "First, we needed to transport Dr. Muller and his essential team from Zurich to Paris immediately. Then our private jet, piloted by John, a former Air Force pilot who had worked with me for years, would take us all to Maputo, the capital of Mozambique. But that was only the beginning. From Maputo, we'd need a smaller aircraft capable of landing on an unofficial runway near Nampula. That specific part almost derailed the entire operation until Cristiano got in touch with a South African humanitarian pilot operating in the region. Simultaneously, we were coordinating the transport of specialized medical equipment, some of it heavy and extremely delicate, across 3 different continents. The operation's complexity seemed to grow with each detail shared. Meanwhile, Dr. Paulo needed to stabilize Seiko over the next 12 hours, with extremely limited resources. Cristiano and I barely slept, operating in a constant state of adrenaline. Every obstacle we overcame brought 2 new ones. "This seems impossible," I murmured at one point when an airport authority denied our request for priority landing. Ronaldo just looked at me, that iron determination in his eyes. "Nothing is impossible, Michael. That's the only absolute truth I've learned in football. When they say something can't be done, it's simply because no one has tried hard enough." At 6 in the morning, we boarded the private jet heading to Zurich to pick up Dr. Miller and his team, Jordan continued, the pace of his narrative quickening to reflect the urgency of those hours. By 9, we were already airborne again, this time with 6 medical professionals on board and nearly 200 kilos of specialized equipment. The flight to Maputo was dominated by technical discussions among the doctors, reviewing every aspect of the procedure they would perform under conditions far from ideal. Cristiano and I alternated between making calls to coordinate the next steps and simply observing that extraordinary team preparing for the impossible. At one point, Dr. Miller asked me directly, "Mr. Jordan, do you understand that the chances of success are extremely limited, even under the best circumstances?" His honesty was brutal, but necessary. I nodded, fully understanding the implications. "Doctor, I've spent my entire career facing odds. Sometimes you make the decisive shot, other times you miss. The only certainty is that if we don't try, Sekou won't stand a chance." Jordan paused, the weight of that memory clearly visible on his face. We landed in Maputo early in the evening, quickly transferred to a smaller aircraft, and as the sun set over the African continent, we were on the final and most dangerous leg of our journey. The next morning, we were attempting to land on an improvised runway in one of the most remote regions of Mozambique, Jordan concluded, his voice carrying the gravity of that critical moment. What we didn't know was that the runway had been damaged by recent rains, and our pilot was warning that we might not be able to land. Through the dusty window of the small aircraft, we could see the little hospital where Sekou was fighting for his life. A set of simple buildings with corrugated metal roofs, surrounded by dense vegetation that seemed ready to swallow it whole. The runway, if it could even be called that, was essentially a strip of compacted earth now riddled with large grooves and puddles after days of heavy rain. The South African pilot, Mark, a man of few words and nerves of steel, didn't hide the seriousness of the situation. The tension was palpable in Jordan's voice, transporting everyone in the studio inside that endangered aircraft. He pointed to the right, where a small crowd had gathered at the edge of the runway. "They're trying to show us where it's safest to touch down," he explained, his brow furrowed in concentration. "But even so, I can't guarantee we'll stop before the end of the runway." I looked at Cristiano sitting rigidly next to me, his fingers gripping the seat so tightly that the knuckles had lost their color. Our eyes met, and in them I saw reflected the same realization that haunted me. We had come so far, mobilized so many resources, only to be defeated by a muddy runway. It was then that Dr. Muller, that remarkable man who had embarked on this impossible mission without hesitation, leaned forward between our seats. "We have to try," he said simply. "That boy doesn't have any more time." Those last moments before we touched down were some of the tensest I've ever experienced in my life, Jordan continued, leaning forward in his chair, while the audience on Colbert's show remained in absolute silence. Pilot Mark, a man of few words and nerves of steel, made 3 low passes over that improvised runway, meticulously analyzing every inch of the terrain. The small aircraft shook violently, battered by upward air currents rising from the overheated African ground. Through the dusty windows, we saw dozens of people running along the runway, frantically gesturing to indicate the least dangerous sections. Their bodies moved urgently under the merciless sun, forming a desperate choreography when viewed from above. In the cockpit, Mark's normally impassive face now shone with sweat, his hands gripping the controls with an almost supernatural concentration. Every movement was precise, calculated, as if any slight tremor could mean the difference between life and death. Not just for us, but for Sekou, whose fragile heart depended on our safe arrival. On the third low pass, when the aircraft almost brushed the tops of the surrounding trees, Mark finally gave an affirmative nod. Jordan recreated the gesture with dramatic precision. He simply looked at us and said, "We'll try now. Fasten your seatbelts and prepare for impact. If we start to skid, protect your head with your arms and hold on to fixed structures." Cristiano, sitting rigidly beside me, closed his eyes briefly. "After so many years scoring goals," he murmured, "it would be ironic if my last act on Earth was a failed attempt to do something that really matters." "The first contact with the runway was brutal, Stephen. There's no other word for it," Jordan went on, his body unconsciously replaying the tension of that moment. "The aircraft hit the ground with an impact that seemed to shake every vertebra in my spine. We immediately felt the violent drag as the wheels struggled to find any traction on that muddy, treacherous terrain. The noise was deafening, a mix of protesting metal, engines roaring in reverse power, and the wet sound of tires cutting through deep mud. Mark fought the controls, his entire body leaning forward as if he could impose his will on the laws of physics through sheer determination. We heard an alarming metallic crash when the right landing gear hit a particularly deep hole. The entire cabin filled with the acrid smell of burnt rubber as the brakes were applied at maximum capacity. Through the windows, the outside world had become a blur of brown and red as we slid sideways, temporarily losing control of the trajectory. Dr. Miller, holding tightly to his seat, kept his eyes fixed on his precious medical kits, as if he could prevent the vital surgical equipment from being damaged by sheer force of his gaze. It was at that moment that I saw something I will never forget. Dozens of people running toward us. They were not fleeing the runaway aircraft, but running to it, positioning themselves at the end of the runway and forming a human barrier. Jordan shook his head, still amazed by the memory. They were willing to use their own bodies to stop us, to prevent us from crossing the safe limit of the runway. "My God," exclaimed the anesthetist on our team, "these people are truly risking their lives for complete strangers. My entire career in luxury hospitals in Europe never showed me an act of altruism of this magnitude." By some miracle of physics, or simply pure luck, we managed to stop less than 15 meters from the end of the makeshift runway, Jordan continued, the relief evident in his voice even after so many years. There was a moment of deathly silence in the cabin, each of us processing the simple fact that we had survived. Then, like a wave crashing against rocks, the crowd completely surrounded the aircraft. Smiling faces, outstretched hands, children lifted onto their parents' shoulders to better observe the unexpected visitors. We disembarked into stifling heat, a dazzling sun that seemed determined to remind us we were in a world completely different from the one we had left in Paris just 24 hours before. The air carried the distinct aroma of wet earth mixed with distant smoke from campfires, human sweat, and the lush vegetation surrounding that small camp of hope. Dr. Paolo, the physician we had seen on the video call, made his way through the crowd, his face simultaneously exhausted and illuminated. He wore a white coat faded from countless washes, stained in some spots, but impeccably clean within the local possibilities. Behind him, a small team of medical professionals watched us with a mixture of reverence and cautious skepticism, as if they dared not fully believe what their eyes were witnessing. Jordan's expression visibly softened, recalling that encounter. Paolo embraced Cristiano with the familiarity of an old comrade before turning to me and the medical team. "When Cristiano told me you were coming, I believed him," Paolo said, his voice carrying the weight of countless past disappointments. "Even when everyone else said it was completely impossible, that no one would cross half the planet to save a single child, I knew you would find a way. Sekou is still alive, but we need to hurry. Every minute that passes is a small miracle your heart can still produce." The real ordeal began when we tried to transport the medical equipment to the hospital, Jordan reported, his serious demeanor reflecting the gravity of the situation. What they called a road was little more than a dirt path, transformed by recent rains into a deep and treacherous mud pit. Two vehicles awaited us, a worn Toyota pickup that must have had at least 20 years of constant use, and an even older military jeep, relics from past times kept running through local ingenuity and stubborn determination. The boxes containing the delicate and heavy equipment, each costing more than both vehicles combined, were carefully loaded by cautious hands. The specialized cardiac monitor, wrapped in extra foam protection, was entrusted personally to one of Dr. Muller's assistants, who held it as if it were a fragile child. The high-potency medicines, which needed to be kept at controlled temperatures, were placed in improvised refrigerated containers with ice brought specially from Maputo. Dr. Muller supervised every move with eagle eyes, occasionally intervening to correct the position of some particularly sensitive equipment. The defibrillator cannot stay in that position, he instructed. The slightest vibration could damage the capacitors and render it useless, and without it, any complication during surgery would be practically a death sentence. Jordan gestured, illustrating the scene. A crowd formed around us, men offering help to carry equipment, women bringing water in colorful jars for the exhausted newcomers, children watching with wide eyes full of curiosity. Our little convoy finally set off, advancing at an agonizingly slow pace. Cristiano was in the first vehicle along with Dr. Paolo and part of the medical team, while I followed in the second with the rest of the specialists in the more sensitive equipment. This mission is literally a race against time, commented Dr. Sophia, pediatric cardiologist from Miller's team, while firmly holding a box of specialized medicines. Every bump on this road represents precious seconds of Seku's life slipping through our fingers. What should have been a trip of less than 10 kilometers turned into an odyssey of almost 3 hours, Jordan continued, his tone reflecting the frustration of that moment. Every meter was a battle against the deep mud that often reached the axles of the vehicles. On 4 distinct occasions, we all had to get out and literally push the stuck vehicles, while dozens of local residents spontaneously joined us. The spectacle was surreal. World-renowned Swiss doctors, covered in mud up to their knees, pushing side by side with local farmers. Cristiano Ronaldo, the global icon who normally appeared only in perfectly produced advertising campaigns, now completely muddy, his face contorted by extreme physical effort as he pushed the back of the pickup along with men, women, and even older children from the community. At one point, when we finally managed to free the Jeep from a particularly deep quagmire, a sudden tropical storm broke upon us. That kind of violent rain that seems to come from all directions at once. In seconds, we were all soaked to the bone, the mud that had been only on our legs now covering our entire bodies. The rain pounded so hard on the vehicle roofs that verbal communication was nearly impossible. Jordan's admiration was still evident in his voice. Amid that chaos of elements and obstacles, Cristiano turned to me, his expression an extraordinary mix of exhaustion and unwavering determination. His face, normally so carefully presented to the world, was now unrecognizable under layers of mud and rain. I knew I carried people on my back during games, he said with a tired smile, but I never thought it would become so literal. Every centimeter we move forward is one step closer to giving Seku the chance he deserves. I won't stop pushing, even if I have to do it for entire days. When we finally spotted the hospital, the reality of the situation hit us with full force, Jordan narrated, transporting the audience to that crucial moment. It was a set of simple buildings, some made of masonry, others with wooden walls and corrugated metal roofs that reverberated deafeningly under the persistent rain. Windows without glass were protected only by torn mosquito screens, and the paint that had once been white was now faded to a pale yellow after years of exposure to the harsh sun and torrential rains. A noisy diesel generator constantly hummed beside the main building, its black smoke mixing with the rain mist. Improvised electrical wires zigzagged across the outer walls, creating a power distribution system that seemed to defy all known safety standards. Near the main entrance, an improvised tent with faded tarps sheltered patients who couldn't fit inside the structure. The outside area, normally full of people, was momentarily empty due to the heavy rain, except for a few solitary figures running between buildings, protecting their heads with pieces of plastic or cloth. Our vehicles finally stopped at the main entrance, and immediately a team of local workers ran to help us unload the equipment, shielding it from the rain with tarps and umbrellas, forming an improvised human tunnel to the hospital entrance. Jordan's expression clearly conveyed the impact of that vision. Dr. Paolo quickly guided us inside, and it was like entering another universe. A world where medicine was practiced not only with science, but with extraordinary amounts of improvisation, determination, and pure willpower. The narrow corridors were lit by a combination of natural light coming through the windows and fluorescent lamps that flickered irregularly with each generator failure. Local doctors and nurses moved with silent efficiency among patients, performing daily miracles with resources so limited they seemed ridiculous compared to the state-of-the-art hospitals we were used to. An older nurse approached, her impeccably clean uniform contrasting with the worn environment. "The medications are losing their effect," she informed us, her English clear but heavily accented. "The little one fights bravely, but his heart is getting weaker. If you had arrived an hour later, I fear you would have found tears instead of hope." We were immediately led to the small room where Sekou was, Jordan continued, his voice now softer. It was a simple environment, lit by two fluorescent lamps that constantly hummed and emitted a cold, bluish light. The institutional, light green painted concrete walls showed moisture stains in the upper corners. A small window with improvised curtains allowed some natural light and the rhythmic sound of the rain in, creating a melancholic soundtrack for the unfolding scene. The air was heavy with the characteristic smell of diluted antiseptics and the metallic odor of medical equipment. At the center of that austere setting was Sekou, a small boy for his 8 years, his dark skin now with an alarming grayish tone, his fragile chest rising and falling at an irregular, labored pace. An improvised oxygen tube was connected to his nose, and rudimentary electrodes monitored his weakened heart through equipment that seemed to belong to another era. Next to him, holding his hand with infinite gentleness, was a man we immediately recognized as his father. Tall, thin, with broad shoulders, but curved by the weight of worry, eyes carrying as much love as terror. He stood up as we entered, his posture revealing extraordinary dignity despite the desperate circumstances. Jordan took a deep breath before continuing. Dr. Miller immediately approached the bed, his years of specialized training replacing any initial shock at the conditions. His movements were precise and methodical as he examined Sekou with advanced diagnostic instruments that seemed almost alien in that rudimentary environment. His team worked in absolute silence, communicating only with gestures and looks, a perfectly synchronized clinical dance. The silence in the room was broken only by the irregular beep of the improvised heart monitor and Miller's occasional instructions. The surgeon's face grew graver by the second. After what seemed like an eternity, he stepped away from the bed and looked directly at us. "The condition is even more severe than the reports indicated," he said with the straightforward frankness of a doctor who does not believe in false hopes. "There are additional complications that were undocumented, and the deterioration is progressing faster than we anticipated. I can't operate on him here under these current conditions. The equipment is too basic," Jordan quoted, recreating the devastating moment for the now completely silent audience. Dr. Muller's words fell on us like a sentence. After everything we had done, all the barriers we had overcome, all the resources mobilized, we reached what seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. "The risk of infection is extremely high," he continued, his voice professional yet compassionate. "We don't have access to compatible blood type for transfusion should complications arise, and the instability in the power source could be catastrophic during such a delicate procedure. In my clinic in Zurich, this would be a challenging but viable operation." Here, he left the sentence unfinished, the silence completing what words could not properly express. Sekou's father, to whom Dr. Paulo had translated the surgeon's words, let out a guttural sound of pure despair. Not a scream or a sob, but something deeper, more primitive, the sound of a heart literally breaking. His shoulders, which had remained raised with such dignity until then, finally gave way, bending as if the weight of the world had suddenly become unbearable. Cristiano immediately approached him, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. The soccer star's eyes shone with held-back tears, but his voice remained surprisingly firm when he spoke. The emotion was palpable in Jordan's voice. "We will not give up," promised Cristiano, each word loaded with an absolute conviction that seemed to defy reality itself. "We brought these doctors and equipment from another continent. We will find a way. We will not let your son go without fighting to the last second, with every resource we can mobilize. I give you my word, not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, but as one human being to another. The father looked at each one of us, his eyes scanning our faces as if trying to assess the sincerity, capability, and determination he saw. Jordan continued, recreating that critical moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but surprisingly firm, carrying the dignity of an educated man who refused to completely succumb to despair, even in the face of the unimaginable. "My name is Emmanuel," he said in careful formal English. "I am a teacher at the local school. I teach math and science to children who rarely have the opportunity to see a current textbook or a real scientific experiment. I sold everything I had to bring Sekou here, our furniture, our small savings, even my lifelong collection of books. Now I have nothing material left, only my son and my faith that you can help him." His words, spoken without self-pity or drama, just as a statement of fact, touched something deep in all of us. Emmanuel then leaned over the bed, gently adjusting the small pillow under Sekou's head. It was such a simple, universal gesture, the care of a father ensuring his child's comfort, that perfectly captured the essential humanity that transcended all differences between us. The respect was evident in Jordan's voice. Emmanuel continued speaking, now with an unmistakable trace of paternal pride, despite the devastating circumstances. Since he was 5, Sekou said he wanted to be a doctor. Not an astronaut, not a soccer player like other kids. A doctor. Even when the heart condition began to manifest, it only strengthened his determination. He watches every procedure done on him, asks questions, memorizes medical terms. During our worst nights at the hospital, when the pain was unbearable, he would tell me, "Dad, one day I will be a doctor so that no other child has to suffer like this. We just need to get to that day." That was when we faced one of the deepest moral dilemmas possible, Jordan confessed, his gaze momentarily distant as he relived that impossible decision. While discussing the limited options with the medical team, Dr. Paulo asked us to accompany him on a brief tour of the rest of the hospital. What we saw in the next 10 minutes broke our hearts in ways I never imagined possible. In every room, every improvised corridor, we encountered children in critical health conditions, some with heart problems similar to Sekou's, others with different but equally serious medical issues. A boy of about 10 with a complex congenital heart defect, his lips almost blue from lack of proper oxygenation. A 4-year-old girl with a severe ventricular septal defect, her small body swollen due to heart failure. 6-year-old twins sharing the same bed, both with valvular problems that drastically limited their ability to play like normal children. In every bed, a unique story. Beside each bed, desperate parents whose only crime had been to be born in a region without access to basic medical care that would be routine in developed countries. Dr. Paulo briefly introduced us to each case, his professional voice barely masking the underlying emotion. "This is Amara, 6 years old, severe mitral stenosis. This is Gabriel, 10 years old, complex congenital heart disease. This is Zinzi, only 4 years old, ventricular septal defect." The gravity of the situation was evident in Jordan's expression. In total, there were more than a dozen children in critical condition in that small hospital, all needing care far beyond the local capabilities, all deserving a chance to live. Cristiano stopped in front of the last bed, where a girl no older than 5 was tightly holding a small worn stuffed toy. "How can we choose?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How do we decide which child deserves to live and which must wait, knowing that waiting probably means not surviving? What right do we have to make that choice?" There was no easy answer to that question, no formula or algorithm that could guide such an impossible decision. "Maybe we don't have to choose," I finally replied, an idea beginning to form in my mind. "Maybe there is a third option we haven't considered yet." Back in the room where the medical team continued assessing Sekou, we discussed the possibilities with brutal honesty, Jordan continued, his tone reflecting the seriousness of that decisive moment. Dr. Muller didn't soften the truth. "Even with adaptations and using all the equipment we brought, the conditions here are extremely precarious for such a delicate surgery. The risk of infection is very high. We don't have access to blood for transfusion in case of complications, and the electrical instability is deeply concerning. If the generator fails during surgery, we would lose the patient within minutes. His assessment was devastating but necessary. Ideally, there would be a fully equipped surgical center, he continued, with adequate equipment, a controlled sterile environment, reliable power support, and a complementary specialized team. But we are hundreds of kilometers from the nearest hospital with those capabilities, and Sekou clearly wouldn't survive the transport. The options seemed to narrow every passing minute. Emmanuel, who had remained silently beside his son during the whole discussion, looked at each of us with a mixture of hope and resignation, the expression of a man prepared both for a miracle and for mourning. It was then that Cristiano, who had been unusually quiet for a few minutes, stepped forward, his eyes shining with the intensity he normally reserved for decisive moments on the field. The audience on Colbert's show was completely absorbed in Jordan's narrative. "What if we bring the surgical center to them?" Cristiano proposed, his voice low but clear. "Not just for Sekou, but for all the children." The idea seemed absurd at first. How could we possibly create a fully equipped surgical center in the middle of one of the most remote regions of Mozambique, and in a matter of hours, not days or weeks? But the more we discussed, the more possible it seemed. We had resources, we had contacts, we had the necessary determination. We would need advanced medical equipment, a complementary specialized team, and all that in less than 24 hours, I enumerated, mentally cataloging the formidable obstacles we would face. It was almost impossible, but almost was the only word that mattered at that moment. And it was exactly at that moment, Stephen, while we were discussing ambitious plans and unlikely solutions, that the unthinkable happened, Jordan concluded, his voice lowering to almost a whisper, carrying the weight of that traumatic memory. The heart monitor connected to Sekou began to emit a sharp alarm, a piercing sound that made everyone freeze instantly. The green line on the small monitor, which had been pulsing irregularly until then, suddenly turned into a straight line, the most terrifying image possible in any medical setting. "Cardiac arrest," shouted one of the local doctors, immediately moving to the bed. Within seconds, the small room exploded into frantic activity, doctors positioning themselves, nurses running to fetch resuscitation equipment, orders being shouted in a mixture of Portuguese, English, and German. Emmanuel was gently but firmly pushed away from the bed by Dr. Paulo, his face a mask of absolute terror as he watched his sons fight for life. Cristiano held him by the shoulders, both watching helplessly as the medical team worked with desperate urgency. The scene unfolded in slow motion, the chest compressions that seemed brutal on the child's small body, the shocks from the improvised defibrillator, Dr. Muller's determined face leading the efforts with professional precision. Time seemed simultaneously frozen and accelerated, every second stretching infinitely while Sekou's life hung by an invisible thread. Jordan looked directly at Colbert, the raw emotion in his eyes conveying the horror of that moment more eloquently than any words could. We were watching that boy die before our eyes, completely powerless. All the resources we had mobilized, all the barriers we had overcome, all the hope we had brought, none of it seemed to matter at that terrible moment when Sekou's fragile life threatened to slip away permanently, leaving only unanswered questions about what more we could have done, what more we could have tried, how much faster we could have arrived. The minutes following Sekou's cardiac arrest were a whirlwind of desperate activity, Jordan continued, his expression grave as he addressed Colbert. Dr. Muller took command with the authority of a battlefield commander, coordinating the resuscitation efforts with mechanical precision. After 3 shocks from the defibrillator and nearly 5 minutes of chest compressions rotated among the team, Sekou's heart started beating again, weak, irregular, but present. "He's stabilized, but temporarily," Miller announced, wiping sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his lab coat. "We have hours, maybe less, before another episode occurs, and each subsequent cardiac arrest drastically decreases his chances." It was at that critical moment that Cristiano and I exchanged a look that needed no words. We both knew we had to act immediately and on a much larger scale than we had initially imagined. While the medical team worked to stabilize Sekou, we withdrew to a small makeshift office where our satellite phones offered the only reliable connection to the outside world. Cristiano gripped my arm with surprising strength before we began. "We're going to do something we've never done before, Michael. We're going to use every person we know, Every favor we can call in, every penny we have. Not just for Sekou, but for all those children. Today we are not competitors. We are brothers on a mission. The next 6 hours were the largest logistical operation I have ever been involved in, Jordan reported, the intensity of that moment still evident in his voice. Cristiano and I stood side by side, each with a phone, making consecutive calls without pause for rest, food, or even water. First, we contacted the CEOs of 3 of the world's largest medical equipment companies. People who would normally require weeks to get a meeting now answered immediately upon recognizing our voices. We didn't ask for discounts or modest donations. We demanded full mobilization. Richard, I need a complete pediatric cardiovascular surgical center transported to Mozambique within the next 12 hours, I said to the CEO of MedTech Global bluntly. I'm not asking, I'm informing you this will happen and you will be part of it. In any other context, this would have been considered absurdly arrogant, but there was something about the urgency of our situation that transcended normal protocols. Impossible by conventional means, but let me make a few calls, Richard replied after a brief silence. I have a shipment ready for Singapore that can be redirected. Simultaneously, Cristiano was speaking in a mixture of Portuguese, Spanish, and English, with airport authorities in 3 different countries, seeking emergency authorizations for unscheduled landings. Meanwhile, Dr. Paulo approached with exhausted but determined eyes. The boy is stable for now, but we need that equipment. I've never seen 2 men moving mountains by phone the way you're doing now. The news of our improvised operation began to spread among our circles of influence, Jordan continued, gesturing to illustrate the magnitude of the response. Former teammates, rivals on the court, other elite athletes, all began to mobilize their own resources without us having to ask directly. Scottie Pippen contacted a pharmaceutical company in which he was an investor and secured the immediate shipment of specialized medications. Lionel Messi, traditionally seen as a rival of Cristiano, activated his foundation in Argentina and redirected a medical team that was about to depart for a mission in Bolivia. Cristiano's phone rang, showing an unidentified number, and I saw him go from exhaustion to absolute surprise in seconds when he answered. Yes, Mr. President, I immensely appreciate your personal support on this matter, he replied, signaling for me to understand he was speaking with the President of Portugal. In less than an hour, we had secured a Portuguese military cargo plane that was on a diplomatic mission in Angola and could be redirected to our location. Even more impressive was when a Swiss medical equipment manufacturer made available not only equipment, but also a full team of technicians for installation and operation. The power of the social capital we had accumulated over decades was being converted into concrete action at a speed I myself did not believe possible. Jordan shook his head, still marveling at the memory. When we hung up the 10th consecutive call, Cristiano looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It was the look of someone seeing possibilities where before there had been only insurmountable obstacles. We have built entire careers competing and winning, he said, his voice hoarse from hours of calls. But this, Michael, this is the greatest victory we have ever achieved together. We are rewriting what is possible when we refuse to accept limits. There was a particularly impressive moment amidst all that coordinated chaos, Jordan recalled, his tone shifting to something close to admiration. Cristiano received a call from a Swiss collector who learned of our operation through connections in the medical world. This man owned one of the largest private collections of luxury watches in the world and had been trying for years to acquire a specific watch that Cristiano owned, a unique piece created especially for him, valued at over 2 million euros. Without hesitation, I watched Cristiano make an offer that left everyone around silent. Jean-Claude, the watch is yours. I will deliver it personally as soon as this mission is completed. In exchange, I need you to release your private jet and crew to transport specialized doctors from Geneva here and to make a substantial donation to create a permanent fund for this hospital. There was a brief moment of silence as he listened to the response. No, I am not selling the watch. I am giving the watch on the condition that you become a permanent partner in this project. The collector agreed immediately, and within minutes, his assistant was calling to finalize the jet's shipping details. When Cristiano hung up the phone, I noticed his hands trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the intensity of the moment. Dr. Paolo, who had witnessed the conversation, looked at him with an expression that blended disbelief and deep gratitude. Jordan himself seemed moved recalling it. That's when I understood that our mission had evolved dramatically. We are no longer just trying to save a child, Cristiano explained, almost as if processing the thought in real time. We are creating something that will continue saving lives long after we are gone. And this watch, it was always just an object. Today it transforms into hundreds of heartbeats that would have been silenced. As we mobilize global resources, the situation at the hospital evolved rapidly, Jordan continued, his tone reflecting the urgency of those moments. Dr. Muller's team had managed to stabilize Sekou through a combination of medications they brought and improvised techniques adapted to local conditions. In one of the adjacent rooms, local doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to prepare the other critically ill children, prioritizing them according to the severity of their conditions. Some members of the European medical team were already examining these children, establishing intervention protocols as soon as the equipment arrived. Cristiano and I alternated between making calls and physically helping with preparations. We carried boxes, moved furniture, cleaned spaces, any task necessary, no matter how mundane or tiring. At one point, I found myself side by side with Emmanuel, Sekou's father, dragging old tables out of a room that would be transformed into an improvised surgical center. His face showed the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in days, but also a renewed determination that hadn't been there hours before. When Sekou got sick for the first time, I felt completely powerless, he confessed as we worked. Now, even if the worst happens, I know we did everything humanly possible, and that, Mr. Jordan, is a kind of peace I never expected to find amid so much chaos. The news of our rescue operation spread quickly throughout the local community, triggering a response none of us could have anticipated, Jordan narrated, astonishment still evident in his voice. Dozens, then hundreds of people began arriving at the hospital, not as passive onlookers but as active participants in the mission. Local farmers, teachers, merchants, students, all showed up ready to contribute in any way possible. When the first helicopter with medical supplies landed in a field adjacent to the hospital, a spontaneous human chain of nearly 200 people formed, passing boxes hand to hand from the landing zone to the hospital. What would have taken hours with the few vehicles available was accomplished in less than 40 minutes. Elderly people who could barely walk sat in chairs, receiving and passing along light packages. Children ran messages between different groups. Women prepared food for all the workers. At one point, we urgently needed to clean and prepare a large outdoor area for the arrival of the main surgical equipment. Within minutes, over 50 men appeared with tools, transforming an uneven, muddy terrain into a leveled and compacted surface. Jordan smiled lightly, recalling the extraordinary scene. The local village chief, an elderly man supported by a handcrafted cane, supervised the work with unquestionable authority. In all my 78 years, I have never seen our village so united, he commented as I passed by him. You bring equipment from the other side of the world, but we contribute something equally valuable, our hands, our hearts, and our determination. Today, every child in that hospital belongs to all of us. The following hours were a race against time and weather conditions, Jordan continued, his narrative pace quickening to reflect the urgency of the moment. The Portuguese military cargo plane, carrying the heaviest and most specialized equipment, including a complete extracorporeal circulation system essential for heart surgery, was facing severe storms over the Indian Ocean, delaying its arrival by precious hours. We received updates every 30 minutes, each one increasing the tension. Diverting to avoid storm cell, severe turbulence over Madagascar, problems with airspace authorization. Each message heightened our anxiety. Simultaneously at the hospital, Sekou's condition began deteriorating again. The small cardiac monitor showed increasingly frequent arrhythmias, clear signs his heart was progressively failing. Dr. Muller, normally so composed, began showing visible signs of concern. We're losing the ideal window for intervention, he informed quietly. If the equipment doesn't arrive within the next 2 hours, Sekou's chances of surviving surgery will drop drastically. Cristiano, who had just returned from helping prepare one of the outdoor tents, heard the assessment, and his face hardened with renewed determination. Without saying a word, he grabbed his phone and walked away for a few minutes. The tension was palpable in Jordan's voice. When he returned, there was an intensity in his eyes I had never seen before, even during the most intense competitions. The cargo plane pilot is taking an alternative route, more dangerous but faster, he announced. When I mentioned Sekou's name and the others, he simply said, "Tell those kids we're breaking through the sky to reach them. We will not fail." The transformation of the hospital during those hours was almost miraculous, Jordan described, making broad gestures to illustrate the scale of the operation. Every available space had a specific function in preparing for the equipment's arrival. One of the larger rooms had been completely emptied, its walls washed with improvised antiseptic solutions, the floor covered with special plastic materials to create a more suitable surface. A team of local electricians, remotely guided by European engineers via video calls, reconfigured the entire electrical system to ensure stable power flow for the advanced medical equipment. Specialized medical tents sent by a Swiss NGO were erected adjacent to the main building, creating improvised but functional recovery rooms. Outside, a secondary landing strip was being marked and leveled for additional helicopters bringing specialized medical teams. Cristiano and I moved constantly between all these activities, coordinating, encouraging, often simply offering our physical strength where it was most needed. At one point, we found ourselves working side by side, carrying heavy oxygen cylinders to the improvised surgical center, our exhausted bodies protesting every movement. The admiration was palpable in Jordan's voice. He paused briefly, wiping the sweat running down his normally impeccable face, now marked by exhaustion and dirt. "I knew we were more alike than different, Michael," he commented between heavy breaths. "But I never imagined our greatest similarity would be this: the absolute refusal to accept defeat when children's lives are at stake. If only the world could see beyond our brands and records." When Sekou began showing signs of imminent heart failure again, the tension reached almost unbearable levels, Jordan narrated, his own voice reflecting the gravity of that moment. The alarms on the cardiac monitor increased in frequency, signaling that the little fighter's heart was rapidly losing strength. Dr. Muller and his team implemented increasingly aggressive measures to keep him stable, each intervention buying only precious minutes. "We can't wait any longer," Miller finally declared, his face a mask of professional determination, barely hiding the underlying worry. "We need to start the procedure with what we have available, even knowing it is inadequate." Emmanuel, who had remained beside his son the entire time, closed his eyes briefly, the weight of that impossible decision clearly visible on his face. At that exact moment, as if in response to an unspoken prayer, we heard the distant sound of airplane engines. We ran outside along with dozens of others, and there it was. The huge Portuguese C-130 descending through the heavy clouds, its massive silhouette never looking so beautiful as in that moment. The pilot executed an impressive approach on the improvised runway, landing with surprising precision given the conditions. Even before the turbines began to slow, the rear ramp of the aircraft was already being lowered, revealing the interior packed with state-of-the-art medical equipment and an additional team of specialists. The emotion was palpable in Jordan's voice. Cristiano grabbed my arm tightly, his voice choked with contained emotion. "See this, Michael. 48 hours ago, we were just two men on a terrace in Paris. Now we are hundreds, united by a purpose that transcends anything we've ever done in our careers. No matter what happens from here on, we have already witnessed the best of humanity." The following minutes were a frantic whirlwind of coordinated activity, Jordan continued, the pace of his narrative quickening to capture the urgency of the moment. The human chain formed instantly, transferring equipment from the plane to the hospital with impressive efficiency. Specialized teams of technicians assembled complex equipment in record time, while others configured systems, calibrated monitors, and prepared medications. The improvised operating room came alive with advanced machines that seemed alien in that rural setting, a state-of-the-art extracorporeal circulation system, digital cardiac monitors, a computerized anesthesia device. Dr. Muller and his expanded team worked in perfect synchrony, like a finely tuned orchestra performing their most important piece. Sekou was carefully prepared for surgery, his small, fragile frame looking even smaller among all those imposing devices. Emmanuel had a few final moments with his son before the operation, whispering words of encouragement and love into his ear. When the moment finally came to begin the procedure, Dr. Mueller looked at everyone in the room. "What we are about to attempt is unprecedented under these conditions," he declared with professional candor. "The surgery Sekou needs would be challenging even in the best European hospitals. Here, in an operating room improvised in hours, the chances are limited." Jordan paused, the weight of that moment clearly still alive in his memory. He didn't need to quantify it. We all understood the gravity of the situation. Cristiano, who had remained close throughout all the preparations, asked a direct question: "What are his real chances of survival?" Miller did not hesitate. His brutal honesty was as devastating as it was necessary. "With the current complications and conditions we have, even with all this equipment, 10% at most." The surgery began at 2300 hours and 45 minutes. 17 minutes under powerful surgical lights that contrasted dramatically with the tropical darkness outside. Jordan concluded, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Cristiano and I joined Emmanuel in the improvised waiting room. Three men from completely different worlds, united by shared anxiety over a small life hanging in the balance. Through periodic updates, we knew Sekou was responding as best as possible given his weakened condition. The medical team worked with meticulous precision, every movement calculated and deliberate, aware that the smallest mistake could be fatal. The complex heart surgery proceeded step by step, overcoming initial obstacles with impressive competence. The atmosphere throughout the hospital was one of contained expectation. Hundreds of people inside and around the building, waiting in respectful silence, many praying according to their diverse traditions. It was when the surgery reached its most critical point, approximately 2 hours after it began, that the unthinkable happened. First, the lights flickered once, twice, then with an agonizing groan from the overloaded generator, total darkness came, a complete blackout that engulfed not only the hospital, but the entire surrounding region. Jordan looked down, raw emotion in his expression as he relived that terrible moment. The main generator had completely failed. At the exact moment, Sekou's heart was literally in the surgeon's hands. I ran to the operating room, arriving just in time to witness a scene I will never forget. Dr. Mueller and his team continuing the delicate procedure, illuminated only by improvised flashlights and cell phones held by assistants. Their focused faces glistened with sweat under that insufficient light, their hands moving with impossible precision in the flickering shadows. At that moment, with the surgeon operating under conditions no professional should face, with Sekou's life hanging by a literal thread under those trembling flashlights, I thought we had completely failed. All our global mobilization, all the gathered resources, all the hope built, everything seemed to collapse into the darkness of that African night. Jordan paused, his gaze momentarily lost in memories before returning to the present in the Late Show studio. His expression held an extraordinary mixture of emotions, pride, humility, and a kind of reverent awe rarely seen on the face of the legendary athlete who was usually so composed. The audience remained in absolute silence, completely immersed in the narrative. Some people in the front rows discreetly wiped away tears. Colbert, normally quick with witty remarks, held a respectful silence, instinctively understanding that he was witnessing something far beyond a simple celebrity interview. The studio lights seemed to have dimmed slightly, creating an almost intimate atmosphere despite the hundreds of spectators present. Jordan took a deep breath, as if gathering strength to finish his extraordinary story. "What happened next was something I will never forget, Stephen. Something that fundamentally changed my perception of the true meaning of community," he continued, his voice lower, but carrying an intensity that held everyone's attention. "While we were paralyzed by that moment of total darkness, something incredible began to happen. First one, then two, then dozens of lights started to appear in the windows and doors of the hospital. The villagers, realizing the blackout, were arriving with any source of light they could find. Old flashlights, oil lanterns, even candles protected in glass bottles. Children ran carrying their small glowing toys. Elders brought crank lanterns kept for decades. It was a completely spontaneous response, uncoordinated, but perfectly synchronized in its purpose. In less than 10 minutes, there were over 100 people forming a circle around the hospital, each contributing their source of light, creating a beacon of collective hope in the midst of the African darkness. Jordan continued, his eyes shining with the emotion of the memory. Some men arrived carrying small personal generators, precious equipment in that region that they normally use to provide basic electricity for their own homes and businesses. Without hesitation, they offered them to the hospital. A young local technician named Jabari, who had studied electrical engineering for 1 year before being forced to abandon his studies due to financial reasons, took the lead with surprising confidence. With rudimentary tools and extraordinary practical knowledge, he began connecting the generators in sequence, creating an improvised but functional system. "We need wires, any kind of conductive cable," he shouted, and immediately people began dismantling their radios, household appliances, even parts of vehicles to provide what was needed. Working by the light of lanterns held by local teenagers, Jabari achieved what seemed impossible: a makeshift electrical system directed exclusively to the operating room. The audience was completely absorbed in the narrative, as if they themselves had been present that night in Mozambique. Emmanuel, who watched all this with a mixture of hope and fear, squeezed my arm with surprising strength. "Do you see this, Mr. Jordan? This is the real Africa that we rarely show to the outside world. We don't just need your technology, we need opportunities to show our own ingenuity and determination." The most extraordinary part was understanding the extent of the sacrifice that community was making, Jordan went on, his tone reflecting genuine admiration. While Jabari completed the last connections of the emergency system, one of the village elders explained the situation in simple but deeply moving terms. To provide enough power for the medical equipment in the operating room, the entire village would be completely without electricity, not just for a few hours, but potentially for days. That meant no communication with the outside world, no refrigeration for food in a region of intense heat, no light during the dangerous nights when wild animals often approach the homes. When I asked if everyone understood the sacrifice, the elder simply smiled with quiet dignity. "The whole community went dark so that surgery could continue," he replied. "We do this not only for Sekou, but for all our children. Every time one of them gets a chance to live, we all live as well. This is our way." Jordan shook his head, still amazed by the memory. At that moment, I understood something fundamental about generosity. I, who had donated millions to various causes over the years, had never truly grasped the meaning of community sacrifice until I saw people who had almost nothing offering absolutely everything. Sekou's surgery lasted hours, against all medical and logistical odds, Jordan continued, the astonishment still evident in his voice. Dr. Muller and his team worked with an almost superhuman concentration and endurance, taking shifts only in the less critical roles. The improvised electrical system failed 7 times during the procedure, but each time Jabari and his team of assistants managed to restore it within minutes. The makeshift operating room had transformed into an almost sacred space, where the most advanced medical technology worked side by side with ingenious solutions born of extreme necessity. Cristiano and I took turns helping with external logistics and staying with Emmanuel, whose stoic calm was only betrayed by the constant movement of his lips in silent prayers. At one point, when the surgery reached a particularly critical moment, Muller sent an assistant to give us an update. "Sekou's heart is responding better than we expected," he informed us, exhaustion and cautious optimism mixing in his voice. "I don't want to create false hopes, but he is fighting with a determination I've rarely seen in patients 3 times his age." The emotion was palpable in Jordan's voice. It was during those agonizing hours of waiting that Cristiano shared with me a vision that initially seemed impossible. "We're here for Sekou today," he said, his eyes red from fatigue but shining with determination. "But what about all the other children who will never have a rescue operation like this? We need to turn this moment into something permanent, something sustainable." While the doctors fought to save Sekou, Cristiano and I improvised a much bigger plan, leveraging the peculiar mix of resources we had at our disposal: his contacts in the football world, my business network, our combined access to people who could make things happen quickly, explained Jordan, the natural strategist momentarily visible through his emotional narrative. Using the few available moments of connection through satellite phones, we began structuring what would become the CR7 Impact Initiative. The idea was simple but ambitious. Use Sekou's incident as a catalyst to establish a permanent specialized medical assistance program for children in remote regions of Africa. Not just build a hospital and leave, but create a self-sustaining system of medical training, infrastructure, and technology. While we sketched this ambitious plan on crumpled sheets of paper, using the dim light of borrowed flashlights, Sekou's surgery continued in the room next door, a constant reminder of what was truly at stake. We're not just planning a charity institution, Cristiano insisted at one point, his voice hoarse from exhaustion, but carrying an absolute clarity of purpose. We're reimagining how global privilege can be meaningfully redistributed, not through temporary aid, but through permanent structural change. When Dr. Miller finally left the operating room, almost 20 hours after the procedure began, his surgical uniform completely soaked with sweat, his hands trembling with exhaustion. The sun was already high on the African horizon, Jordan continued, the relief of that moment still visible on his face so many years later. The entire hospital and the village surrounding it seemed to hold their collective breath as he removed his surgical mask. The operation was a success, he announced simply, his words unleashing a wave of emotion that spread like wildfire through the gathered community. Emmanuel dropped to his knees, openly sobbing for the first time since we had met him. Cristiano, always so controlled in public, embraced the surgeon with tears freely streaming down his face. In the weeks that followed, as Sekou recovered with extraordinary resilience, our vision began to take concrete shape. We secured partnerships with 5 major international health organizations, long-term funding commitments from global corporations, and most importantly, a scholarship program for young Mozambican doctors to study at elite institutions and return to serve their communities. Jordan gestured with his hands as if building something invisible in the air. The plan born that night of despair expanded far beyond what we initially imagined. What began as a mission to save one life transformed into an initiative to revolutionize pediatric care in some of the world's most underserved regions. As Cristiano said at the official opening of the first permanent center, the true miracle was not Sekou's operation, but the operation of hope that it inspired. Jordan reached into the inner pocket of his blazer and carefully pulled out a small envelope from which he extracted some photographs. The program's cameras zoomed in to show the images in detail as he presented them to Colbert. "These are current photos," Jordan explained, his pride evident. "This is Sekou today, fully recovered and unrecognizable from that fragile little body we saw 7 years ago. Here he is at his renovated school, which now has a fully equipped science lab and a complete library. This is the inauguration ceremony of the Nampula Pediatric Cardiology Medical Center, which began as an improvised operation in a room lit by lanterns and is now a permanent medical complex with technology comparable to any European hospital. And this," he said, showing the last photograph with special reverence, "is the current medical team, composed 60% of local professionals, many of whom were trained through our scholarship program. The images were displayed on the studio's big screens, allowing the entire audience to witness the extraordinary transformation. The numbers are something that still moves me deeply. So far, the initiative has helped more than 800 children in situations similar to Sekou's, not only with heart surgeries, but with all kinds of specialized pediatric procedures. Most importantly, we are building local capacity, doctors, nurses, and technicians who will multiply this impact for decades." The pride in his voice was unmistakable. "Emmanuel told me recently something I will never forget. You didn't just save my son's heart. You planted thousands of new hearts in our community, and they are just beginning to bloom." "Many people ask me why we kept everything a secret," Jordan reflected, putting the photos away. "We kept everything confidential at Cristiano's request. He insisted that the focus should be on the work, not on who was doing it. The moment this becomes about our images," he would say, "we lose the essence of what we've built." We worked in the shadows, always focused on impact rather than attention. The truth about Cristiano Ronaldo is that, while the world sees his goals and fame, he spends nights worrying about children he will never meet. As he told me, "My trophies will gather dust, but the heartbeat of a saved child will continue for decades. Colbert leaned forward in his chair. Why reveal this now? The question hung in the air as Jordan considered his answer. Because Sekou is coming forward to tell his story. He was just accepted into a prestigious preparatory school with a full scholarship through our foundation. At only 15 years old, he can now study and pursue his dream of one day becoming a doctor, something that would have been impossible without the efforts of that night. The audience applauded emotionally. Last week, Cristiano called me saying it was time to share our story to inspire other athletes to do the same. This is a moment of multiplication, not celebration. I have spent my life defining greatness by wins and titles, Jordan concluded. But now I understand that true greatness is in the impact we have on the lives of others. It is in using our influence for the shadows where real people face real challenges. That is why I consider the CR7 Impact Initiative my most significant legacy. In the end, it doesn't matter how many points you scored, but how many lives you changed. The audience rose to an emotional standing ovation as the program ended, showing the initiative's QR code alongside a photo of Sekou on his first day at preparatory school. Did you enjoy the story of Michael Jordan and Cristiano Ronaldo? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and don't miss the next video that's already waiting for you on the screen. See you there. Oh, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what you thought about the ending of this story.